let us detract a little bit from our prior course of videos in which I mentioned a history of modern modal logic in order to build up to an introduction to formal modal logic and different forms of modal logic. Since that has gotten a little bit boring, I will get back to it in a few weeks' time, but right now I want to focus on different portions of philosophy and really push out my opinions about different branches of philosophy, because I don't just read about logic, I don't just formulate views on logic. That is a very mathematical and abstruse part of philosophy. I also enjoy doing things and reading things pertaining to more popular and more interesting and colorful parts of philosophy. So right now I'm going to jump into the philosophy of religion, in which a central question exists. We always want to ask about the existence of God. Humans have been doing that for many lifetimes. That's why many branches of religion has sprung up. You got your monotheistic religions like Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and you also have polytheistic religions like Buddhism, Jainism. You have a huge variety of religions. But the central question that many academics like to ask when they want to analyze the doctrines promulgated by religion is whether the concept of God, the existence of God, is rational. Can you deduce it? And within philosophy, within modern analytic philosophy, you can really subsume philosophers into three different camps. Either they are theists, where they argue for the existence of a philosophical God. They are atheists, they argue against the existence of God. They claim that you can deduce or induce that God cannot exist. And you have got agnostics, who claim that it is simply impossible to know about God's existence, or they just do not want to engage in such a conversation. They just don't find such conversations fruitful and do not want to reveal their opinions about it in public. So let us now look at one key argument that has been advanced by a very modern, very recent, and still alive philosopher heavily involved in Christian apologetics. His name is William Lane Craig, and he has championed this argument a lot, I think, from his PhD thesis days. This is one of the strongest arguments in philosophical literature, arguing for the existence of a philosophical God. So let us embark on this argument. The Kalam type arguments can be generalized, and they usually undertake this form. Premise 1, everything that begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist, meaning that there exists a period of time in which the universe did not exist, meaning that at a certain point t equals to 0, and beforehand there was no time and no matter. And the conclusion is that necessarily the universe has a cause. I have appended the modal operator necessarily here, because when you look at further arguments for the philosophy of religion, you realize how important modal clarifications are and how powerful it can be. But we'll just examine the content of this argument first, and also the structure of this argument. And we will refrain from talking about modal arguments until we reach that part. Let me first start with the structure of the argument. To say that an argument is valid, it means that the conclusion logically follows from the premises. It's logically airtight. In the case that the premises are true, every single premise is true. If the argument has a valid structure, the premise will necessarily be true. Okay, the premise will necessarily be true. It always follows from the premises. These Kalam type arguments are actually a form of modus ponens. If I reduce it into predicate calculus, into classical logic symbols, you will get if P then Q, and P implies Q, in which case P and Q can actually be formed from premise 1. This premise can be rephrased into a material implication. If X begins to exist, then X has a cause. So X begins to exist is P. X begins to exist is P, and X has a cause is Q. If X begins to exist, then X has a cause. X begins to exist. Therefore, X has a cause. And if you put in the universe and substitute it with X, you will essentially get Kalam type arguments. And as shown in this truth table, we can prove that it's a valid argument. It's a valid form of syllogism. There is a valid mode of deduction called modus ponens. So now let us build on. We have found out that Kalam type arguments are structurally valid, but in order to accept an argument rationally, the argument must be sound, and having a sound argument has two different components. The argument has to both be structurally valid, and it must consist of true premises. So now, since we have already established that Kalam type arguments adopt the modus ponens form of logic and they are structurally valid, we'll now examine whether the premises are true, or rather we will provide arguments from literature about why the premises are true, and rebuttals and counter arguments. Let's examine premise 1. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. If something exists, it implies that it is part of an actual mind-independent reality. Obviously, you will assume that an external world exists. Immanuel Kant has made a very important statement when he rebutted Anselm's ontological argument, which I'll talk about in the future. He remarked that existence is not a predicate, meaning that existence should not be treated as a quality that can increase or enhance a concept. For instance, in certain versions of the ontological argument, it might be erroneously argued that existence is a perfection that adds to the greatness of being. Craig and many other philosophers reject this idea, as they argue that this move conflates the logical role of existence with substantive content about what makes God what it is. So this is an introduction about what existence really means and how it holds in Kalam type arguments. When we say that X begins to exist, X began to exist if and only if it exists at some time t is more than 0, and there exists an interval prior to t during which X did not exist. This is the definition of beginning to exist. It's a very basic one. We have already clarified existence and beginning to exist, and now we can embark on the actual argument. Craig provided 3 reasons to support premise 1. There's a picture of William Lane Craig here, a portrait of him, and we'll now examine the 3 different arguments. First, rationalism. Mackey is a very famous atheist philosopher who has built on the modern problem of evil. He remarked that there is no good reason to assume a priori that such is the case, and by such he refers to premise 1. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. But William Lane Craig argues that it is rational to assume a priori that such is the case, and he provides the argument from metaphysical intuition. It's intuitive that something cannot come from nothing. This is simply an axiom that is built into the logical foundations of so many humans. Hume has mentioned that effect without causes can be conceived in mind, and what is conceivable is metaphysically possible. This is a common argument adopted by many to argue against metaphysical intuition, which metaphysical intuition actually stems from an ancient, I think ancient Greek philosophical concept. I'm not entirely certain, but that's why Hume has something to talk about it. But it's also applicable in arguments against the Kalam cosmological argument. There's a central rebuttal against all these kinds of arguments against premise 1. Just because we can form a coherent image, a mental image of something, does not guarantee that it does not violate necessary conditions. Hume assumes that what is epistemically possible, i.e. conceivable, is equivalent to it being metaphysically impossible. But that's not the case. You can attempt to conceive of a world where 1 plus 1 equals 3. I can imagine a world that is similar to mine, but when I key in 1 plus 1 into the calculator, it gives me 3. And when I put 2 apples together, somehow another apple appears and it becomes 3. We can conceive of a world, we can visualize the images of these instances materializing in the world. But we realize that there are hidden nuances which render it a logically inaccessible world. 1 plus 1 equals to 3 leads to many logical contradictions, and as such in the world, mathematics will fail, and physics will fail, and logic will fail. So when we conceive of the world where adding 2 apples result in a new apple materializing, it is not a world where 1 plus 1 equals to 3. It is simply a world where somehow objects will spring into existence by some hidden physical law. And it doesn't imply in any ways that we are really conceiving a world where 1 plus 1 equals to 3, because such a world is not logical, and we cannot conceive of something that violates the laws of logic, because the laws of logic are so deeply ingrained into our mental faculties that we are assuming the laws of logic whenever we conceive of a possible world. Second argument: reduction to absurdity. If premise 1 is false, then it will be inexplicable why anything cannot randomly come into existence from nothing, which is absurd. Why is it absurd? If premise 1 is false, it means that things can come into existence spontaneously, completely uncaused. But that's simply absurd, because it means that anything can come into existence. It means that there is no powerful agent, be it a mathematical agent, a natural agent, or a personal agent like God. There's nothing restricting matter from simply materializing. And because there's nothing restricting matter from simply materializing in front of us, anything can just spring into existence, and the world will be in chaos. Imagine when you're looking at your laptop, looking at this video, and suddenly a horse just appears in front of you, and then a plane appears in front of you, and then a cow appears behind you. If premise 1 is false, such things can happen, which is completely absurd according to our understanding of the world. And the third and stronger reason, or rather argument for premise 1, is by inductive reasoning. The conditional probability that something can come into existence uncaused is astronomically low, because we have we have had so many a posteriori verifications of the converse. Every single day when we live, we have never ever observed an instance of things coming uncaused. Everything that has come into existence can be explained by a cause. We have never seen a Boeing 777 spontaneously materializing in the middle of the city. Obviously, sometimes we sleep, and when we wake up overnight, graffiti can appear on the street walls. But graffiti that has come into existence is not uncaused. We can explain it. There's a direct cause. There's a personal agent who had sprayed graffiti on the concrete wall. And when we look at scientific experience and the scientific consensus, for instance, every single observation has had a cause. Even quantum observations have causes, and the cause is the wave function. The cause is an agent observing the wave function, leading to wave function collapse if you hold the Copenhagen interpretation. And because of wave function collapse, it leads to the detection of observables, and all observables can be modeled by a certain operator on the wave function. That is the scientific consensus. A common argument against it is also from the path of science, and it is argued by Quentin Smith. Quantum particles, virtual particles, spontaneously emerge from quantum vacuum transiently and randomly. They randomly emerge, and they only exist for a very, very split microsecond time frame, and then it disappears again. And this is supposed to exemplify uncaused natural phenomena. But we can easily rebut this. A quantum vacuum state actually contains a 0-point energy. It is not really nothing. It is not true nothingness. It is not philosophical nothingness. When we refer to nothingness, which is the nothingness before universe had begun to exist, there is no energy, there is no matter, there is no time. It's a singularity. Another possible argument against inductive reasoning is very obviously the problem of induction. It started with David Hume, and then it continued with the new riddle of induction, where you have your glue and your plane, but those will be discussed in the future. We need a lot of content knowledge about induction in order to talk about it, but it is still great to bear in mind that a possible path of arguing against premise 1 is by attacking the rudiments of inductive reasoning. Let us now examine premise 2, temporal finitism, which is the universe began to exist. It also implies that time is finite. There are two different groups of arguments supporting it: philosophical arguments and scientific arguments. Number 1 is more deductive in nature, and number 2 is more inductive in nature. Philosophical arguments. You have got Hilbert's Hotel. Hilbert's Hotel is a thought experiment, which I'll expound on in the future when I talk about the philosophy of infinity. But its conclusion, its strong conclusion, is that it provides an evidence of the metaphysical impossibility of actual infinities. Actual infinities are infinities that are actually infinite. It's really an infinite set of objects. That's what it's meant. And within the Hilbert Hotel, a fully occupied hotel with an infinite number of rooms can accommodate an infinite number of additional guests. Why is this so? Because let's say that the infinite number of rooms are all filled, and then a new guest comes, and you can perform an operation. Like you can say, every single guest in every single room moves to the next room. It moves to the n+1 room. And then you have an empty space. And when another guest comes, you can say it moves to some other room, where the room number is an output of some other discrete mathematical function, and you can repeat this process to infinity. So you can accommodate an infinite number of additional guests. And therefore something like this that violates basic logic shouldn't be allowed to exist in real life. The second argument is that it is impossible to form actual infinity by successive addition. If time is infinite, and each instances of time is a successive addition, it would imply that we have reached actual infinity. This current instant is actual infinity, and we have reached it by successive addition of time. However, Craig argues that this is impossible. An infinite series of past events is metaphysically impossible, because if there's an infinite number of past events, then our current instance cannot exist, because you would have to add an infinite number of events, and that would imply that to reach infinity it would require an infinite number of time. But obviously we know that we are at a finite amount of time, because in order to even exist, in order to even experience things, we must be at some instant. And if time is infinite, we'll never reach this instance. This instance will not exist metaphysically. Let's look at some objections. There's a very common objection it's called the presentist contradiction. Craig is a presentist. He views the past and the present as metaphysically non-existent. But when we look at the Hilbert Hotel analogy, it assumes the existence of past instances of time, because let's say that each instance of time fills one room in the hotel. We are at a single instance of time. If there are an infinite number of past instances of time, that means that an infinite number of hotel rooms will be filled. But because Craig assumes that the past does not exist, how do you fill the hotel rooms with something that does not exist? So many has argued that this really causes an inherent contradiction within Craig's argument. A response by Craig is that the past need not exist at the current moment for the Hilbert Hotel argument to work, as long as they are instantiated in reality, meaning that as long as you can refer to it, meaning that it had existed in reality, we can in fact fill it up into rooms of the Hilbert Hotel. He mentioned an argument by Aquinas. Aquinas is a very famous Christian theologian, a Catholic one, in which he made a lot of contributions to theology, and one of the arguments he had against that can be used here is the argument that, or rather is the consideration of an analogy. Let's say that a blacksmith from an eternal past has used and broken successive hammers from an infinite past. The discarded hammers no longer need to exist for us to count there to be an infinite number of discarded hammers. The hammers have been discarded, they did not exist, but we can rationally conclude, and it is true, in fact, that there exists, or there had existed, an actual infinite number of hammers. Actual infinity. This is what Hilbert's Hotel assumes, and it proves that we can really map time into Hilbert's Hotel rationally. Let's examine some scientific arguments, which are more complex in nature. It's harder to understand because scientific arguments are, the considerations, the postulates are obviously quite esoteric in nature, but I'll try to explain it to the best of my capabilities. Let's look at the lambda CDM theory of cosmology. It is also known as the standard model of cosmology. It is really the consensus of astrophysicists as to the start of the universe, or rather the origin of the universe. It's a mathematical model of the Big Bang theory, and in the model, it provides a good account of certain empirical mysteries, hitherto empirical mysteries. When this model was released, a lot of empirical physics mysteries could be solved and accounted for within the model. Some of the mysteries include the abundance of isotopes of hydrogen, helium, and lithium within the universe that can be detected by apparatus, the accelerating expansion of the universe, which can be measured indirectly. And these things can be predicted by the lambda CDM theory, can be modeled by mathematical equations, but there's one interesting implication from it that is very important for Kalam type arguments. If you extrapolate the model to t equals to 0, which is the origin of time, it will actually model a singularity, a mathematical singularity. Like a graph of, it's like functions with a hole. You know, it's like continuous functions but with a single hole in it. Within that mathematical singularity, all physical laws fail. Density, energy, temperature will be extrapolated to infinity. They reach a limit of infinity. All physical laws will fail to describe the state of the Big Bang. So this provides some evidence that an origin did exist by extrapolation. It may not be a very strong evidence, but coupled with other scientific considerations, it makes a very, very good case for Kalam type arguments. Let us now examine the second law of thermodynamics. The picture here shows Lord Kelvin, one of the founding fathers of modern thermodynamics, one of the first to describe the second law of thermodynamics, and the first to postulate and support the notion of thermodynamic heat death, which is central to the usage of the second law of thermodynamics in Kalam type arguments. The second law can be derived from postulates and axioms of thermodynamics, and you can essentially state it in the form: the total entropy of a closed system increases for an irreversible process, and the universe is a closed system, is an energetically isolated system, and time is an irreversible process. As such, you can conclude that the total entropy of the universe increases over time. And the thermodynamic hypothesis is a very interesting hypothesis about the ultimate fate of the universe. It claims that the universe will reach asymptotic thermodynamic equilibrium after a sufficient amount of time. And when it reaches this stage, heat death will occur. There will be a limit where heat death is reached, because all energy in the universe that can be rearranged has been used up. Entropy is about the arrangement of energy and about the organization of matter. It's a very abstract concept, but it is a very finite measure that is slowly depleted over time. And it's something modeled by the laws of thermodynamics that drives all life processes. The moment the total entropy of the universe has reached the maximum, there will be heat death. And however, if the past were infinite, then thermodynamic equilibrium would have been reached. Then heat death would have occurred by now. But obviously heat death has not occurred, because if heat death had occurred, the universe would have died and we wouldn't have existed. And furthermore, to support the infinitude of the universe, you can look at the BGV theorem. It's made up of it's a concatenation of three scientists with very long names, and I can't really remember them, so I abbreviate it into the BGV theorem. It's a theorem that deduces that any universe that has been expanding on average throughout its history cannot have an infinite past, and it's deduced from arguments, from theorems, from general relativity, special relativity, and many fields of physics. This is a very powerful argument, because it, in fact, is a theorem that concludes that given our scientific consensus of mathematical physics, it necessarily follows that history cannot have an infinite past. and it justifies the origin of time and the origin of the universe concomitantly. It makes a huge assumption, which is that the universe has been expanding on average throughout its history. So when people want to debunk this, when physicists attempt to argue against it, they come up with alternate models which assumes that the universe had in fact not been expanding on average. And so it shows that a singularity is not physically entailed. One of the physicists involved in deriving this theorem, called Velikat, he actually published a paper showing that exploiting the loophole, which is this assumption that the universe has been expanding on average, exploiting this loophole actually does not entail a past eternal universe. It shows that the alternate models actually imply some kind of finite universe, but very strange finite universes, which really contravenes scientific consensus. And as such, he argues that the BGV theorem is the best model for the universe. And all three of these scientific arguments really point towards the fact that the universe really did begin to exist. And let us assume that these two premises are true, and all the arguments that has been mentioned by Craig to support the two premises are all completely right. It's completely right, and it's rational to believe in the premises. And because the Kalam type arguments are structurally valid, then the conclusion will be true. Let us take the conclusion is true. Necessarily, the universe has a cause. We can analyze the conclusion and come up with further post conclusions about the qualities of the cause. Number one, no natural cause can exist prior to the existence of the natural world. Because before the universe had begun to exist, time and space did not exist. So the cause is unbounded by time and space. The cause is outside of time, and it is spaceless, timeless and spaceless. Secondly, causal chains must terminate in the cause. There is a very common issue with causality, in which causes face an infinite regress if the universe had been infinite. However, if we say that the universe had begun to exist at the time, and it was caused to exist, that implies that the cause is the first cause, and the first and uncaused cause. It is the cause that causes everything else. Every single causal chain can be traced back to the cause of the universe. Thirdly, if we use Occam's razor, which is a philosophical razor that guides you into accepting what is the better model if you have got multiple competing models that are all equally rational, it maintains that the causeless cause is most likely singular. Why? Because it is simply the simplest explanation. This is obviously kind of a weak argument, because if you don't agree with Occam's razor, then you will say that the causeless cause can be a causeless causes instead, meaning that the God in this case, if you accept all else, then the God can be polytheistic. Number four, agent causation is the sole cause of the creation of the universe. Agent causation essentially is a cause with free will. Why? Why must the cause of the universe have free will? It's because if the cause of the universe has no free will, if it is some kind of mathematical cause or some other abstract object as a cause, then the universe would not have begun to exist, because there is nothing controlling the behavior of the cause to spontaneously create the universe. You need to consciously create it. If it had no free will, then the universe would not even have begun to exist. The cause would just be there as a background cause without the universe having sprung into existence. From the descriptions 1 to 5, we conclude that there exists an uncaused singular cause with free will who, without the beginning of the universe, is changeless, immaterial, timeless, and spaceless. We can also conclude that the cause is likely enormously powerful. It is enormously powerful because it caused the whole universe. It started physical laws. It started physical laws that are fine-tuned. The universe is a very complex space. It also started time. In order to even start such a thing, you must be enormously powerful. What is the best cause or suspect that fits the best into our 6 criteria for the cause? As Craig argues, it is God. Therefore, God exists.